This is the Open University.
Knit 1, turn, slip 1, turn, purl 5, slip 1, knit 6, turn.
Knit 1, purl 5, slip 1, turn, purl 7, knit tog, stitch tog, turn.
Knit 1,
Purl 7,
slip 1,
stitch tog,
purl 5, slip 1, knit 6,
turn.
turn.
Good morning. It's a beautiful morning here in Berlin. I've come full circle this decade back to Berlin because I started here and I left here and then I came back. So I wanted to do my review of my teenies, let's call it the teens or the teenies this decade, which we're coming to the end of. And I always like to define decades just when I'm coming to the end of them, when we're collectively coming to the end of them. Because then you kind of know what they've been about. You start shaping the story in retrospect. All stories are really shaped in retrospect. So what has this decade been about for me? I want to do an A to Z. And A, for me, this decade has been about austerity, agility. Agility is really the nice word. You see, we started off this decade talking a lot about austerity because we'd just had the financial crash in 2008 and the banks didn't trust each other, the economy wasn't functioning properly, toxic loans in boxes of derivatives had basically collapsed the whole financial system. So there was this crisis which we slowly began to emerge out of, having taken real hits on confidence, real hits on our economies in the West, all over the world really, because the world has grown so interrelated. So austerity was the government's response in a lot of different countries, and that meant basically cutting back on public spending and all the things precisely which, as they said at the time, there was socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. So basically, if you were too big to fail, if you were a big bank or a big corporation, you were bought by the taxpayer. In Britain, we had RBS, which was my bank at the time, the Royal Bank of Scotland. For a while, it was the biggest company in the world before I think Apple displaced it. But it was all just sort of imaginary, trading derivatives, ridiculous deals done by rogue traders like Nick Leeson. Expanding this company to this sort of phantom dinosaur kind of black spectral company, which seemed to take over the world, but couldn't really make their computer banking work. I mean, I closed down it was one of the good things I did this weekend, this decade, was close down my Royal Bank of Scotland account. They collapsed and were bought out by the British taxpayer. And so agility is just the sort of cant word that people now use to, you do agile desking, for instance. That means you no longer have an office. You no longer even have a little cubbyhole in an open plan office. You have to basically be told where to sit every day. You bring everything you have, or you take everything you have from a locker and put it to a different place every day. So agility is the new word for austerity, and it is happening in the workplace. It's all tied up with 0 hours contracts and with kind of digital nomadism, which is something I tried during the decade. I probably tried that mostly in 2018 when I spent 6 months in Southeast Asia just kicking my heels in cheap countries before I could move into this flat in June of that year. And it's fun, digital nomadism. If you're able to be a precarian, I guess we're skipping to P there, because P is about precarians, pots and Paris for me this decade. Precarians were people who, I think artists were pioneers of the precarian lifestyle, and we, by working on projects and basically what pleased us at the time, or what we could, wheedle out of temporary employers at the time, we pioneered this lifestyle by which nobody's quite certain anymore of where their next dollar is coming from, but it does make for an interesting life in a sense, teetering. If you can teeter on the edge of a financial precipice with equanimity, then you're kind of okay as a precarian. It's actually not as bad as it's sometimes made out to be. The other A's I have for you are art world. So the art world became I guess I was in the art world sort of operating as a performance artist in the last decade, the noughties, and then it kind of ended. I did an exhibition in New York, a performance with Aki Sasamoto, who continues, to do very well in New York as a performance artist, and it was called Love is the End of Art, and it was kind of my response to the financial collapse of 2008, and it really was the end of my art career, because although I continued to be an unreliable tour guide and this sort of thing, work in museums, that was a kind of height to nowhere. My art career was always going to be just a playful sidetrack from my music and writing careers. So it petered out with the irrational exuberance of the noughties, with the financial crash. Zach Foyer, who was the New York gallerist who put on my shows, he got out of the art world as well eventually and went up. I think he does a bicycle hire business in upstate New York or something now. So that changed, but the art world continued to set my agendas, really, I guess, in this decade, the teens, because it was a bubble. It was a bubble for the super rich, and it was a bubble of optimism because they had money and because they were doing okay. Somehow I could draw something from that. I tried not to be jealous of their good fortune. I steered clear of the really commercial end of it, though. I liked the kind of conscience-stricken art world, which was the stuff curated like Documenta and the Venice Biennale, with a sense of appropriate guilt. I think guilt is good. I'm a Calvinist enough to think that guilt is good, and guilt in the art world can produce some political leverage, which is useful. So I was cleaving to the art world and getting a lot of my ideas from biennials and Documenta and the Venice Biennale, notably. This apartment apocalypse. I don't know, apartments and apocalypse. I suppose eco-catastrophe has been looming ever more strongly in my mind as a theme of this decade, and we'll come to that in some of the later items. B is for bucolic horror, because that's the theme of my 2012 album, Bibliothèque. It was a kind of sense of Wicker Man or Blood on Satan's Claw, these sort of cult British Hammer horror films or Hammer-like films, which were set in the countryside and saw the countryside as a dystopian place of pagan ritual, which of course one feels mixed feelings about, because pagan ritual can be wonderful. Japan really demonstrates how pagan ritual, if it's not demonized as Christianity did in the West, it can actually be a source of great fun and a way to celebrate sexuality and the change of seasons and harvest and grain and all that sort of agrarian stuff. So, but B is also inevitably for Brexit. This is where the decade took a horrible turn. Terrible things happened in 2016. David Bowie died, and that many people have said, the whole world sort of moved off its axis from that point on, and everything just got increasingly nightmarish. Bowie died, and George Michael died, Scott Walker died, Leonard Cohen died. There was the Brexit vote, which was an ill-informed and even criminally aided and abetted vote, a referendum. Of course, referenda have become a spurious new form of democracy, which is supposed to have supplanted and replaced our existing parliamentary democracy, which is a representative democracy where people are elected to represent your views but not to actually simply execute them. So this was apparently just an advisory referendum. People wanted to leave the European Union, but based on all sorts of lies about bendy bananas and, all the stuff. I don't need to go on about Brexit very much, but it has been a huge shadow across the lives of British people. I don't know my citizenship. I don't know my rights. I don't know what I'm going to be experiencing, in terms of where I can live in the future. And so this has simply refocused my identity as a tourist. That I really, I've learned this decade to be a tourist, because mostly I was living in Osaka on a tourist visa, which meant that I had to leave every 90 days. So I had to fly a lot, long haul, which is a pain. I hate flying, but it was necessary in order to live there. The reason I went to Osaka after Berlin, I had a very nice settled life in Berlin. until 2010. And then my girlfriend was having visa problems. My Japanese girlfriend was having visa problems living in Europe, because you're not allowed to continuously live in Europe on successive tourist visas. So then she moved back to Osaka, and then I said, well, listen, I'll come and live with you in Osaka. And but then I was the one with the visa problems. I never really got in trouble with the visa authorities, but because they're trying to boost tourism. Tourism is a massive industry now in Japan, increasingly so with the Olympics coming up next year. So I was fine. Occasionally I was questioned, why did I have so many stamps on my passport? And when that happened, I would simply go to the passport house in London and get a new passport, which you can do without any particular reason. They just take your money and say, okay, here's the blank document. And of course, the authorities in Japan would have it all on computer anyway, but they wouldn't really consult that unless there was some sign you were a security risk. So, I became a tourist. Another B is books. I've got written down here, balkanization and books. Balkanization of the web into various kind of, touch screen devices and things, which made people a bit lazy and took away the sort of articulacy which I experienced on Click Opera as a wonderful kind of seminar, a daily seminar. My written blog of the noughties turned into eventually video blogs this decade, which are much more finger food. I call it finger food, where you can swipe and the thing talks to you, but you don't really talk back to it very much. And so a lot of the interaction and the seminar quality, the real Open University quality that Click Opera had, was lost in this decade, unfortunately. I did express, I used to be a columnist for various people like the New York Times and Wired in the noughties, and that kind of turned into being a food critic, an unreliable food critic for the Japan Times, and writing art reviews and things more in this decade. So I continued with journalism, but I kind of went more into dilettante-ish or aesthetic subjects. But one of the things I heralded this new decade by saying was that I was more interested in the onion and less in the opinion. In other words, onions are pungent, physical, tangible objects in the real world, and opinions are ten a penny. And we've really seen opinion coming home to roost as a kind of awful influence on this decade, which is that everyone who can comment on social media platforms, Web 2 as we were calling it at the beginning, now we just call it social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. Opinion seems to be terribly important, and at the same time terribly unimportant there. I mean, anyone can have their stupid opinions and fight for them and call each other morons, and not even be able to spell moron. As people embraced that, there was the rush, the here comes everybody moment for the internet. I kind of abandoned the internet along with a lot of other people who'd been hogging it before when the normals didn't have enough bandwidth to come on, didn't have enough money or time, disposable time to come online. I mean, it sounds snobby, but we were pioneers of the internet in previous decades, in the 90s with websites, in the noughties with platforms, blog platforms like LiveJournal. I moved away from opinion. I realized my own opinions were kind of no better than anyone else's, really, or it's a waste of time. Opinion is not inherently that interesting. What is interesting is experience. So traveling, giving a sense of the tactility of things, or going back to pre-digital media like books. Books became tremendously important to me. A photograph I saw in Milk Japon magazine in the mid-teens, just of a girl posing in front of the bookshelves of the French Institute in Tokyo, made me suddenly get this weird fetish for buying second-hand books with light-coloured spines. It just does a sort of aesthetic thing, many of which I don't even read. Here's a book about Georges Perec, for instance. I would find these in a bookshop in Osaka called Ehime Books, which is run by an old lady who's now either died or closed her shop. I noticed on Street View that the shop is no longer there. So unfortunately, Ehime is no longer. There is a branch of it run by her daughter in Tokyo, near Waseda University, which continues. But anyway, this was my source of these books, and I just realized that instead of spending money on Apple products, a new laptop or whatever, I could get so many books, for that same money. A cable, a new Apple Power cable costs €90 or something. For €90, I could get like 45 books of this type. These wonderful avant-garde kind of 20th century books by André Breton and people like that. So I was really investing in the 20th century and its elite culture rather than Apple, Facebook, Amazon, all that stuff. And like a lot of people getting back into analog records, for instance, vinyl was another thing I was collecting, Japanese folk records, which are not on Spotify. These things I was sampling from my mid-teens albums are not on the streaming platforms. They're still too esoteric for that. So I'm trying to keep ahead of the culture which is too accessible. On the one hand, it's displacing all the old culture sources, like the book and record shops, which made city centres interesting in the past, mostly chased out by, Amazon warehouses out of town, and streaming and digital sources. But there are still treasures to be found in second-hand shops. Clothes as well, equally important. I suppose clothes would have to be C, cycling, curation, collaboration, and clothes is all the C's that really mattered to me. I had a bicycle, a Japanese bicycle with a tall saddle. Fifth Avenue was the brand, with dark green paint and no gears at all. Good brakes, good baskets on back and front, and I'd just go cycling in Osaka. Osaka was like a blank page for me. That I didn't really make any new friends there. I did start having dalliances with married women and things like that, which was very naughty of me. But there was a kind of weird kind of dividing of the ways with my Japanese partner, who got more into her job and into Takarazuka theatre, which she really loved, and which supplied, I guess, the absent romance in her life. But she was out at work, working for a phone company as a personnel manager every day until pretty late, till 9 o'clock. So I was just left to my own devices. I got a hell of a lot of work done. I published in this decade, I think, 5 or 6 books. There was the Book of Japan's, Un-America, Herr F, Pop-Up, and of course my niche, my memoir, which is coming out next July. And, umpteen records. How many records did I do? I did Thunderclown, Bibliotech, Momus in Samoa, Sun Butler, Momus McClymont 1, Bambi, Momus McClymont 2, Hearspool, which is a series of radio collages I made, Terpsichore, Glyptotech, Pubic Intellectual, which is a compilation that came out in Cherry Red, Scobberlotchers, Pitticock, Create, which was another compilation of my the whole of my creation output, essentially, Pantaloon, and then Accordion. So it was hugely productive. The kind of boredom and blankness of my life in Osaka, with occasional skirmishes, with willing partners, and with a lot of travel as well, because I was constantly coming back to Europe, constantly, not just Europe actually, also places like Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Israel, not America though. I didn't go to America the whole decade. I stayed well away from America, although I kind of quite liked Obama and obviously was completely appalled when Trump was elected. But I don't really have anything to say about America. I mean, the previous decade, I spent quite a lot of time. I actually lived in New York for 2 years and kept coming back to New York to do things like the Whitney Biennial. And of course, that connection continues with some of the books I'm publishing being published in America. I'm not published in Britain. I had one British publication, which was this Scottish version of the Book of Job, the Book of Scotland's, which it's important to me that finally I got a British publication. Apart from my lyrics collection, Lusts of a Moron, nobody had ever published me in Britain. All the publishing that happened has been in Spain, France, and America for me. I have, nevertheless, a fairly flourishing literary career on the back of this British indifference to my writing. Same with the magazines, actually. They're all, Art Agenda and People, New York Times, Wired, all American. Nobody in Britain ever commissions me to do anything. The next letter is D, which I've written down democracy and deficit, really this idea of referenda, but also the populist fringes becoming important during the decade, and the old traditional parties not doing so well unless they, as is happening just now in Britain, stalk the extremist parties and try to resemble them. Let's see how this will turn out for Boris Johnson. He's trying to turn himself into the Brexit Party to squelch the Brexit Party by stealing all their ideas. UKIP/Brexit Party, Nigel Farage. Does this make Nigel Farage the most powerful man in Britain, or does it squelch him and kick him out entirely? Let's see. I don't know. The other thing that happened this decade was the Scottish independence referendum, and although I'm anti-nationalist and anti-referenda, nevertheless I voted yes, a very positive yes to that, because simply because for purely pragmatic reasons that I want Scotland to stay in the European Union, and because Scotland is much more to the left in general of England, and we constantly vote for things which we don't really get. Apart from our own, we have our own parliament now, a devolved parliament, and that's giving us things like free entries to museums and free education for students, which the English don't have. But we continue to be a socialist country in the way I recognise from the earlier parts of the 20th century, when there was this social contract. Post-war, the Britain should become a land fit for heroes. And England seems to have forgotten how to do that, and also how to be welcoming to other people who come in to help with our economy, like immigrants. Democracy and deficit. Okay, I mean, you read about all this stuff every day in the papers. I don't know how much you need me to talk about that. E is for Europe, entrenchment, and ex-urbanism. Entrenchment is really just this process of everyone supposedly coming back into their own borders. Post-Brexit, there's no way I'm going back to Britain post-Brexit. I'm not being called back to the Garden Gate, as I express it in Rootless Cosmopolitans. I am a Rootless Cosmopolitan, a citizen of nowhere, one of these dreaded, awful global cosmopolitan elitists or whatever. But there is this strange kind of connection between the economic migrants and this kind of so-called expats. They are the same thing, essentially. I am that kind of expat, and I'm quite happy to continue living in a vague global way as a non-citizen or a tourist or whatever. But ex-urbanism is a kind of interesting thing, because I'm investigating the possibilities of living outside cities, and I don't think I want to do that yet, if ever. I love cities so much. But I do. This was the reason for my recent trip to Stornoway, and the reason I'm living in this particular apartment is that the people who were living here moved up to the countryside. So it's something I'm really fascinated in, because the countryside is beautiful, and you can get in Japan very cheap houses. So this was one of my fantasies of this decade, was maybe go back to Japan, maybe buy one of those cheap houses for 30,000 euros or whatever, and redo it, live in a place near a railway station, so I wouldn't need a car, but a place that's beautiful and that I could call my own for the first time in my life. But I don't know how much I want to own anything, and I don't know how much I want to stop travelling, and I don't know how much I want to abandon cities. Probably very little. F is for France and finger food and flygskam. Flygskam is, of course, the Swedish word for the shame of flying, and I definitely am feeling flygskam. That's why I've curtailed my long-haul flights to Japan every 3 months. France is where I spend a lot of my quality time, all my quality time essentially these days, because I have a French girlfriend now, and that's kind of something I wouldn't have predicted 10 years ago. I really seem to be sexually very oriented to Japan, and also culturally very oriented to Japan. The thing is, I had to go to Japan to kind of cure myself of that, because I was sitting, the last decade, mostly sitting here in Berlin, writing about Japan for Click Opera, and then the next decade I was basically in Japan, so you can't really write about Japan when you're in it. What I was doing was photographing, tumble-down arcades and things, and in Amagasaki, and buying second-hand clothes from old ladies, and sort of styling myself after these old ladies who I admired so much, this generation of very elderly Japanese who have their own particularity still, and who, when they die, they leave their houses and their clothes, and a lot of the clothes that I own and buy are from those people. There's a weird kind of relationship I had with them. Yeah, I had to go to Japan really to stop speculating about Japan and fantasizing about Japan. And I noticed, I think really the interest in old books for me started with I called her my girlfriend, this charming old lady who ran this, basically a porn bookstore where they had one shelf full of European paperbacks from the 20th century. But I noticed I was buying, French writers, German writers, and I was reinvesting, getting more interested from Japan in Europe. It's a certain filtered version of Europe. First of all, it was just books about, sort of Lewis Carroll and things like that, or Saint-Exupéry. I noticed there were particular authors that the Japanese liked. They were usually French or Victorian English, whimsical, slightly with a slight dubious sexual angle as well, that being the Japanese, of course. But this was my way to reinvest in Europe. So I started to come back, mentally to come back from Japan. I was coming back every 3 months, of course, and I was traveling in Europe with. I had a German. I had people because Hisai and I in Osaka had sort of drifted apart and had separate bedrooms by mid-decade. So I developed these strange kind of traveling relationships where I'd travel with people, and in relationships which were, we'd share hotel rooms and things, but it wasn't necessarily sexual. So I had a German traveling partner for a couple of years in the middle of the decade. I had an Irish traveling partner before that. I had one Japanese traveling partner, I suppose that's pretty much it. I would often say to people, I'm going to be in such and such a city, so why don't you fly in and join me? And then it's less solitary. I was very solitary in Japan, and I really needed to be sociable when I did these European trips, which would typically be about a month or 6 weeks or something, and then I'd go back to Japan and just get on with my work. But I wanted to travel à deux. I wanted to be to look like a couple, even if I wasn't actually a couple with that person. So thank you to those people who travelled with me. So G, we've only got to G. G is for Greta, and Extinction Rebellion, of course, Greta, and for gentrification. These are topics, again, you can read about in pretty much any newspaper. Gentrification is the eternal musical chairs game that we play when we kind of improve, we artists and creative type people improve parts of cities and therefore make the rent go up and then can't afford to live there anymore. It's happened with Neukölln, the part of Neukölln I lived in before, which I hyped up to publications like Wired and the New York Times. I tried to call it Neubecker, but it's Kreuzköln. It's like Zanderstrasse was where I lived. And now it has lots of very nice kind of cafes with very good, third wave coffee and stuff, but I couldn't afford the rent anymore. Well, actually, that's not true. I probably could afford it now, but it's kind of become a slightly superficial place. I'm in a much more working class district here, so this game continues of having to basically improving an area and then getting out because you can't afford it anymore because you've improved it too much. Gentrification, I see a good side to gentrification now. I don't think it should stop. I think, it is the destiny of areas to improve themselves and to have better coffee and all the rest of it. But, exclusion is a real social problem as well. H is for hiding and hairstyle. Hiding and hairstyle. Hiding, I suppose I've been hiding in Japan. And hairstyle, I don't know. You can have a hairstyle without having much hair. That's all I'm going to say about that. I enjoy making myself into a piece of graphic design. I think you get better at even as your basic equipment collapses and begins to give out. Because your 50s is probably the last really good decade you're going to have health-wise and, in terms of feeling bodily strength. So, I don't know. There are ways to kind of disguise the decay, but that's probably enough. You can have hairstyles. iPhone. I is for iPhone, internet, and Instagram. God, I mean they're so central and they're so kind of everywhere that they're also nowhere at the same time. The iPhone has a lot to answer for in terms of the finger food culture of social media being superficial and being kind of boring and making the internet more boring. At the same time, it's the Swiss Army knife of electronic gadgets, and it's everything one could have dreamed of as a boy, having in one's pocket. A translation machine, a camera, an excellent camera in terms of the new iPhone 11 Pro, a device you could actually make films on, and a device you could then upload and instantly publish the films on worldwide. So everything about it is kind of cool, but somehow there is a banalization going on as well, which is that laziness and advertising have kind of ruined things. It's really hard to avoid advertising on iOS. That's my main beef with these little devices, and the reason I keep my laptop. J is for Japan. I've already talked about that. K is for kleptoculture. Kleptoculture. This is my think piece for the New York Times about kleptoculture. Kleptoculture is just basically that you steal things that are good, and that you have appetite for things. To have appetite is really important. But also that Simon Reynolds published this book called Retromania, which I think defined the spirit of the times quite well. If you look at what I've done for my book jacket for Niche, for instance, it's a memoir in pastiche, so it has to be a pastiche of a 1960s Farrar Straus and Giroux cover. The graphic designer Alex Murto and I started by looking at Robert Lowell volumes, a volume called The Dolphin, for instance, which was blue and green. The typography and everything was obviously retro, and if you look at Alex's website, a lot of his design is retro. It is retromania, and if you listen to bands, listen to music, so much of the music that people make now is trying to be the music of the past, including my own music, which tries to be a kind of circus music from the Weimar Republic or something. So why are we so obsessed with retro? We're in a new century, but we're not actually coming up with new styles, and this is a real reproach you can make. Where, for instance, it's the centenary of the Weimar Republic itself. Now, the Weimar Republic, along with modernism in countries like France and America and Britain, was all about saying, the First World War has made a tabula rasa. We can make a new culture now. Oh, the futurists in Italy, we can make a new culture now, starting from zero, and it's going to be very shockingly fresh. In certain little areas of music, like I suppose trap or whatever, you might get that feeling of people starting, but possibly it's because we haven't had a world war, this kind of reset from zero, which world wars tend to do, and the fact that people are killed in wars, and then literally you have to start with this kind of exuberance of let's make some new people. The Roaring Twenties was very much like the 60s in the sense that there was this exuberance of a kind of peacetime era following a war, in which there was a baby boom because there weren't that many men left. The men had been killed in these wars, and then you had to make a lot of new people. And the economy was booming as these new people started arriving and feeding into the economy. And so I don't know. You've got to temper your appreciation for those boom periods by saying that they were also predicated on war, on global war, such as we haven't seen. We're lucky not to have seen that kind of war this century yet. Who knows, the resource problems and the ecological problems may well lead us to one. And the retrenchment into your own borders and your own nations seems to be some kind of preparation for war to me. So I'm very worried about that. But you have to also say that there were some exciting things culturally which came out of those wars, not the wars themselves, but the post-war peace booms. So where have we got up to? L, love. Love is super important, and I've been lucky enough to discover love in the last couple of years, having come back to Europe. So I'm in love, and M is for memoir, and that's coming out next year, and that's my kind of summation of all the decades I've been through, not just this last decade. N is for novels, nomadism, and Noemi, the love person. O is for onanism and orgasm. Gosh, what can I say about onanism and orgasm? Sex. Sex is a great hobby. I don't know that there is a cybernetization of sex in that it's debatable. Obviously, if I look back at the kind of things, I keep sexy pictures from 2010. If I looked back at those, I would probably think, gosh, that was very primitive, and we have much more realistic sex online now. So I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I'm not becoming some kind of sex robot. But at the same time, love is there to come along, and as books and as physical records and analog media do, real people in the real world have a primacy, and in a way, the sort of cybernetization of sex simply makes you realize in the end how important reality is. That you could simulate the most realistic sex with machines and vibrators and kind of contact with somebody through a computer screen, but really, reality is always going to outstrip that, literally. P is for precarian. We've already talked about that. For pots, I don't know why pots, because I got this weird obsession with pots, and I was living in 2018 in Tokyo in a pottery shop, a kind of pottery showroom, and collecting postcards of pots. Not actually collecting pots. I did buy one pot when I moved into this flat, and I wrote a song about pots, which was about Bernard Leach. Actually, when David Bowie died, I found out that he'd been a collector of Bernard Leach's pottery. I didn't even know that. Bernard Leach, a British man who was orientalized and who came back to Cornwall and worked with Hamada, the Japanese potter, to make British pottery in the 50s in the manner of Japanese pottery. Someone else I met at a pottery stand in the Frieze Masters Fair was Jarvis Cocker, and he seemed terribly interested in those pots as well. A lot of people are interested in pots. I suppose that's also an analog art form, craft art form that became sexy again. Pots. And Paris. Paris is another P. I'm spending a lot of my time in Paris, as I've told you, and that's interesting because it's a throwback to the 90s when I lived in Paris for 2-3 years, and I'm enjoying that. I'm enjoying various little rhymes you get, and when you look back at your life, you get to my age, you see some moments rhyming with other moments, some patterns repeating, some negative things repeating some positive things. Paris is a positive for me. I really sync with the city. This time round, I'm syncing with it faster because I have an electric scooter, and that's a really fun way to experience the city. I go along the now closed to traffic, the roads along the side of the Seine, and I see Paris evolving into a much more, because of tourism, essentially. Tourism has vastly improved Paris, because now you have these initiatives which are there for the tourists, like closing off the banks of the river to car traffic and making it much more a destination. The thing is that we've, in the 20th century, designed cities as transit routes to some unknown destination, which was probably your garage in your suburban house. Now we have city centres as destinations, and that logic is only going to increase in many, many cities across the world, that we want the air to be breathable for a start. We want there not to be pollution. We want there to be things to do in the city centre. We don't want Amazon to put all the shops outside in warehouses. We want there to be shops in the city centre and things to do, experiences to have, museums to visit, and pretty girls to see, whatever, good coffee to drink. And the electrification of vehicles is helping that, and the sort of hybridization, balkanization of transport methods. We need cities to be much more tolerant of a huge different spectrum of vehicles going at different speeds in different lanes, cycle lanes and all the rest of it. Q is quotation, which why is Q quotation? I'm quoting a lot of authors or pastiching the voices from my memoirs, so I suppose that's, but also because quotation seems to be what we do musically. It's part of retromania. It's part of a postmodern kind of accommodation with past cultural forms. That's always going to be going on in art, because tradition and the individual voice, as T.S. Eliot put it, that is the way culture operates. There is tradition, and then there are your individual takes on it, and also a continuous reinvention or a recombination of traditional elements to make the art of the future. R is a retromania, which we've just talked about, and referenda, which we also talked about as a kind of menace to the democratic forms that we already have. Which, I wouldn't mind if we switched entirely to referenda. Why not have referenda for absolutely everything? If you're going that way, go that way the whole hog, Ask people to vote electronically through their computers. their iPhones, whatever, for what they want, and then give that to them. If that's what you're going to do with Brexit, do that with absolutely everything, and okay, it's going to bring some awful attitudes back. There's going to be flogging in the public squares and all the rest of it. But really, if that's the way you're going, go consistently that way. If that's not the way you're going, let's impose things, through the representative parliamentary system that we already have, or even go the way of China and have a really authoritarian decision to, say, limit families to one child, whatever. Maybe some of these things are necessary given the ecological crisis we're going into, because nobody's ever going to vote themselves out of being able to drive a car. You're going to have to tell them, no, you simply can't go in that street. No, you can't go in that city. Keep your car, outside. You have to tell people these things, and it's unpopular. As Macron found out, this is what the Gilets jaunes movement in Paris was sparked by, his eco-tax on diesel fuel, which is a disgusting, polluting substance which destroys city life and makes your breathing difficult. But people in the countryside, the provinces, didn't want to pay any more because they depend on their cars. They didn't want to pay. That's what the Gilets jaunes movement comes from. It's not a liberation movement. It's not even a left-wing movement. It's kind of people. It's played more into the National Front in France than the left, but it does have some leftist connections as well. So S is for scooter and slow travel. Slow travel became very important to me, with obviously as a result of Flixskam, my shame about flying. So now I'm a little more affluent now, and I can afford to take slow trains, to take less efficient means of travel, and to stay in hotels overnight. So it might take me 2 days or even 3 days to get to Paris from Berlin. It could take 1 hour in a plane, but I tend to do it on slow trains and just sort of enjoy the process of being on a train and not being stressed, not being rushed. Slow travel is very important, but also ecologically very important. T is for tourist visa, and we talked about that. U is for undressing. Undressing, gosh. I suppose there was a certain moment in Osaka when I had this hobby of nudism, so I'd go to really quiet places like forests or mountainsides and just undress and take a photograph of myself undressed and then put my clothes back on, because I have a weird attitude to undressing. I'm a little bit shy about it, but also I'm excited by my own shyness. Oh, you're learning everything today. V is for vlogging, and vlogging has replaced blogging, and I enjoy it. I like the textural richness of video and all the media you can add in and the editing you can do. Telling a story with editing excites me. It's one of the things that's excited me. Since 2016, I started the Open University series in December of 2016. W is for Weimar, and Weimar, we've mentioned it's 100 years since the founding of the Weimar Republic in 1919. And I'm kind of living in a sort of Weimar bubble. Some people say we're all living in a Weimar bubble, and that some kind of Nazis are already menacing it. But we have to be careful with that kind of parallel. We don't actually have brown shirts on the street. At least last time I looked out, there weren't any. X is for X Pro 1, and that's the camera I bought when my father died in 2015. He didn't leave very much money. He left a pretty small legacy. I think at one point in the 90s he had a lot of shares in EasyNet, and they were worth a lot of money notionally. At one point in the late 90s I was going to buy Apple shares, and I'd calculated that I would be a millionaire now if I had actually invested £10,000. I had a publishing deal, and I had 10,000 quid I didn't know what to do with, and I thought at one point I was going to just buy Apple shares. Just before Steve Jobs came back to Apple, I would now be a millionaire if I'd done that. But anyway, my dad left money, which I spent on a camera, a digital camera trying to look like an analog camera, which was very typical of this decade. I guess you could say, if there's a word like Flixskam, there could be a kind of digiscum, which would be the shame of being digital. A lot of things are pretending to be analog when they're actually digital. So I bought a fake analog camera, which is really just broken down. It was never great with autofocus. It was second-hand when I bought it. But it's now the memory card doesn't stay in, and it's touch and go whether it even records when I ask it to record. So I'm now recording these vlogs on my iPhone 11 Pro. Y is for youth and for yes. Yes, the yes vote in the Scottish independence referendum. I'm hoping we get another, and I will be fighting to make sure we get another referendum, because we're sure as hell not going down last to the mast of the sinking ship of Little England, especially a Little England whose captain is Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage. Forget that. We're not going down on that ship with you. So yes, and and yesterday, I suppose, and youth. Youth and yesterday start to become the same when you're kind of pushing 60, as I am now. So that's... you can't really talk about being youthful anymore. I still do occasionally get referred to as junger man in the German shops. They still seem to have a very flexible definition of young man when they address you here. So that's flattering when it happens. But I suppose I'm having to come to terms with the idea that my endlessly extended youth really can't be extended beyond the age of 60. You can't be a young 60-something. So we're going to see what that feels like. I suppose the horrible injustice of life is that I have a girlfriend in her 20s, so I can sort of imagine when I'm with her that I'm in my 20s. But being presented to her family, for instance, her family is obviously rather concerned at my advanced age and thinking about how will our tribe, continue if this guy is so old? Is he still able to produce children? And Z is zoocide. Zoocide is my word for the extinction of animals and insects and biodiversity, and so it's a serious ecological point about how we're killing everything except ourselves. Humans are way too successful, and anything we don't like and we think is an obstacle, like insects. The Green Revolution was all about trying to make crops insect-proof, but of course crops, plants, everything depends on everything else on the planet, and there is no planet B, so, zoocide is suicide. And that's really my A to Z of the decade.
Open University.
Knit 1, turn, slip 1, turn, purl 5, slip 1, knit 6, turn.
Knit 1, purl 5, slip 1, turn. Purl 7, knit hog, stitch hog, turn.
Knit 1,
Purl 7,
slip 1,
stitch hog,
purl 5, slip 1, knit 6,
turn.